Chapter 1. The Rift. Xander could feel something watching him. Its stares prickling at his neck like needles. He turned around sharply to the corner the feeling had come from. Nothing. There were just rolled up mats at the corner. His gaze lingered, half expecting something to jump out and attack him. Nothing happened. This was not the first time he'd been having the feeling. Something was watching him. He was sure of that, but... Begin! A voice called, drawing Xander's attention back to the fight. Xander shifted his weight, settling into a ready stance as he squared off against his opponent, Danny, one of his students. The young man across from him had a solid build, though not as muscular as Xander was, and a focused look was in his brown eyes. He was determined to impress Xander, that was for sure. Xander caught the faint murmur of breaths around him. The other students were watching closely, gathered around the fight and shifting their focus between Xander and Danny. For a moment they both held their breaths, Xander's green eyes locking with Danny's, and then the fight began. Danny moved first, lunging forward with a sharp jab aimed towards Xander's shoulder. Xander sidestepped smoothly, redirected the strike with a quick block, and circling around to keep his distance. They both adjusted, Xander pressing forward this time with a controlled series of strikes, testing his student's reflexes and his ability to defend. The student managed to block the first two hits but stumbled slightly on the third. Taking advantage, Xander shifted his stance, catching his opponent off balance with a quick sweep of his leg. But in the brief pause that followed, he felt it again. That strange, prickling awareness at the edge of his senses, as if someone else beyond his students was watching him from the far corner of the room. He flicked his gaze toward the shadow just for a second. Mistake. His student seized the opening, landing a light strike to Xander's ribs. Xander returned his focus in an instant, giving a short nod of approval before taking charge of the exchange. He shook off his distraction and grounded himself in the fight with a series of breaths. With rapid movements, he closed the distance between them, forcing Danny back to the defensive and finishing the bout with a quick takedown. Danny hit the mat with a thud, earning a series of winces from the watching students. They began to clap afterward, making comments and observations among themselves. Helping the young man back to his feet, Xander gave a slight smile. Good job finding that opening. Keep your guard up next time, Danny. Don't lose your footing just because you've landed a hit, he said. The student nodded, massaging his side with a grimace on his face. Thanks. He walked back toward his colleagues, earning a few claps on his back. Xander turned to the rest of the class with a smile. That's all for today, he announced, glancing around. Good work, everyone. Maybe next time another one of you will be able to land more than a hit. The students exchanged respectful bows, filing out of the dojo, a few murmuring quietly among themselves as they left. Soon the room was empty, and it was only then Xander let out a quiet sigh and sat down on the mat, glancing back toward the shadowed corner where he felt the strange presence. But now there was nothing, just silence and empty space. He frowned. He shouldn't have lost his focus as he did back then. He pushed the thought aside as he stood and reached for his water bottle. A moment later, his phone buzzed, where he'd left it on the bench. He glanced at the screen to see a message from his sister. Dinner's almost ready. We made your favorite stir-fry, the message read. Another buzz later and a photo of the dish, colorful with vegetables, popped on his screen. He chuckled, setting his phone back down. Rolling his shoulders, he returned to the center of the mat, settling into his stance again, and focusing on his breathing. With the dojo silent around him, he started working through his movements, taking precise and steady steps. His dark hair clung to his forehead with sweat, and his piercing green eyes focused intensely on an invisible opponent. The rhythmic sounds of his strikes echoed off the walls, filling the silent space with a symphony of disciplined violence. After an hour of rigorous practice, Xander finally paused, breathing heavily. He straightened and stretched, feeling the satisfying burn of exertion in his muscles. As he reached for a towel, a sudden, inexplicable chill swept through the room. The feeling of being watched came again, more intense. The lights flickered, and the air seemed to hum with an eerie energy. What the hell? Xander muttered, straightening and glancing around the dojo. Felt that unsettling sensation, as if someone or something was watching him. The feeling came from all around him this time, biting his senses. His instincts, honed by years of martial arts training, screamed at him to be on guard. Before he could react, a blinding flash of light erupted in the center of the room, accompanied by a deafening crack. Xander shielded his eyes. The light was too intense. He felt a strange, forceful tug, as if he were being pulled apart molecule by molecule. Panic surged through him, but he struggled to remain calm, to focus on the breathing techniques his master had taught him. As quickly as it had began, the light vanished, and Xander found himself lying on the ground, gasping for breath. The dojo was gone, along with the evening. It was nighttime. From the silvery light of the moon that bathed his surroundings, he noticed he was in a dense, ancient forest, the likes of which he had never seen. Towering trees with twisted, gnarled branches loomed overhead, their leaves casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. The air was thick with the scent of moss and damp earth, and sounds echoed from all around him. He pushed himself up, wincing at the bruises forming from his abrupt landing. His eyes widened as he took in his surroundings. This was not Earth, he knew instantly. He was in another world entirely. Then Xander looked up and noticed he was not alone. The twin moons hung low over the forest, casting a cool silvery glow that filtered through the thick canopy. It wasn't common to have both moons in the sky so close to each other like they were like this. Their light caught in the leaves and shone on the ground, illuminating Princess Leila as she moved carefully along the winding path, a worn book in her hands. Her attention didn't linger long on the strange proximity of the moon in the sky. Instead, her eyes traced the words in her book, her voice soft as she read, yet steady enough to be heard by those followed closely behind. "The prophecy speaks of a warrior," she read aloud, her tone reverent. "One from another world who will appear here, in this forest, under the light of the twin moons." The masters, Rel, Yin, and Lotus, that accompanied her on her stroll, listened with quiet respect as they trailed behind her. Kelzon pushed forward behind Leila, with a dismissive snort. Kelzon was the princess's personal guard, a lean and strong man with cold blue eyes that missed nothing. But he couldn't pretend to believe the ridiculous words the princess had spoken. To him, all this talk of a savior was foolish, a distraction from real strength. Leila glanced up from the text, sensing his objection, even if he hadn't spoken a word. "Something you'd like to say, Kelzon?" she asked calmly, keeping her gaze steady. The princess always kept up the royal modesty, even now as they moved through the forest. She was a young woman of 19 with long silver hair and striking violet eyes. A blue dress with intricately woven patterns hung over her petite form, but her demeanor exuded power regardless. Kelzon didn't miss a beat. The words he'd been holding back spilled forth impatiently. "Only that it's a waste of time. There's no warrior, no savior coming to rescue us." He shifted his gaze from the sky to the forest path, muttering, "This is not what Xenonium Prime needs. We don't need stories. We need our own fighters." Behind him, Master Rel's gaze narrowed. The older man's broad shoulders and towering frame lent him an imposing presence, and he didn't care for Kelzon's tone. "The prophecy has guided and protected our people for generations," Rel said, a note of warning in his voice. "The least you can do is respect it." Kelzon's eyes flickered in annoyance as he scanned the darkened woods. Respect? He respected real strength, real warriors, those who trained and proven themselves, not some distant myth. "If you ask me, we should be looking to our strongest fighters to go find the crystal," he replied flatly. "Wasting time on a mythical chosen one is just weak." Master Lotus raised an eyebrow, casting a sidelong glance at him. She was as sharp as her name implied, tall and lean, with the eyes of someone who had seen every possible side of a warrior's life. "And I suppose you think you're that warrior?" she asked, the edge in her voice clear. Kelzon tightened his mouth and looked away, refusing to acknowledge the question. The masters might hold their beliefs, but he wasn't about to be convinced by mere words. Leila, however, had heard enough. She stopped, turning to look at him, her violet eyes holding steady against his dismissive stare. "If you don't believe in the prophecy," she asked, her voice soft yet unwavering, Why did you come with us tonight? There was a flicker of something in Kelzon's expression, a hint of defensiveness, perhaps, though he would never admit it. He looked up at the twin moons. Even he couldn't pretend the occurrence wasn't normal, and the prophecy had mentioned a twin moon. He discarded the thought as quickly as it appeared, and met the princess's gaze. "My duty," he replied, as though that answer were enough. "My duty is to protect you, princess. If you wanted to search the forest all night, then that's what I'll do." For a moment no one spoke, each of them quietly absorbing the words in their own way. Rel held fast to his faith in the prophecy, believing that the warrior would come, as they always had. Lotus, though ever skeptical, found a hint of humor in Kelzon's defensiveness, but knew better than to press him. And Leila, for her part, chose to focus forward, yet silently wondering if the others truly understood what was at stake. She believed in what the book said, and if Kelzon didn't, so be it. She continued, Suddenly a blinding light, a brilliant white light that fell from the sky like a star and split the night in two, erupted from the edge of the forest, piercing through the dark forest with a brightness that forced everyone to shield their eyes. The light gathered with a force that rippled through the entire forest, disturbing the trees and gathering dust. Once it was over, the forest went silent, and there was little sign of what happened, save the little disorientation the witnesses felt. Kelzon's hand flew to his blade as he dropped into a defensive stance, his gaze sharp and focused on the sudden disturbance. But before he could react further, Leila was already sprinting toward the light, the masters close on her heels. "Princess, wait!" Kelzon called after her urgently. He gritted his teeth and tightened his grip on the hilt of his sword as he pushed forward harder. But Leila didn't slow down, her eyes fixed ahead as she plunged deeper into the forest. The group followed, darting between trees, their breaths quick as they closed the distance. The light gradually softened but remained a steady beacon, drawing them forward until the trees finally gave way to a small clearing. There, in the middle of the open space, stood a young man, tall, lean, with dark hair and piercing green eyes. He looked utterly lost, his face a mix of confusion and wariness as he took in his surroundings. Leila's eyes widened, her breath seizing in her chest for a moment, and a breathless smile broke across her face. "Gods above, he's real," she whispered, her voice filled with quiet wonder. "I knew it." Kelzon looked on in shock. For all his doubts, he hadn't expected this. A living, breathing warrior standing exactly where the prophecy had said he would appear. No, he wouldn't accept this. There had to be an explanation. Xander's gaze darted between them, the unease clear in his expression. Where am I?" he asked, his voice tense. "Who are you people?" Leila took a step forward, but Kelzon held up a hand, urging caution. Xander reacted instantly, shifting into a fighting stance. His muscles coiled as he fixed a wary gaze on Kelzon. "Stay back," he warned, his voice low and steady. Kelzon's eyes narrowed, impressed by the stranger's readiness. He hadn't expected a stranger to take a stance so quickly, let alone one that conveyed such skill. But Leila raised her hand slowly in a gesture of peace, taking a calm, measured step forward. The stranger was confused and disturbed, she noted. "I know this must be confusing," she said gently, her voice soft but reassuring. "You have questions. I imagine a lot of them, and I promise we'll answer them as best we can. But first, let's try to calm down, all right?" Xander held her gaze for a long moment, his stance slowly relaxing, though his eyes remained guarded. There was something in her voice, a kind of sincerity, that made it hard not to trust her, even if nothing around him made any sense. Seeing him ease, Leila offered a small smile. "You're on Xenonium Prime," she began, keeping her tone careful but warm. "And I believe, no, I know, you're here because of something far greater than either of us can imagine." Before Leila could continue speaking, a distant cry rang out through the forest. It was a guttural, inhuman sound that sent a shiver up Xander's spine, making him flinch and turn his eyes in the direction it had erupted from. It was unlike anything he had ever heard, both chilling and unnatural, echoing through the trees like a warning. He couldn't see anything, though, not with the thick forest around him. Kelzon was the first to speak, his tone sharp. "We need to leave. The forest isn't safe after dark." Leila hesitated for only a moment before nodding. She turned to Xander, her voice calm, despite the urgency. You'll have your answers, but first, we need to get to safety, she said. Xander frowned, glancing toward the direction of the sound. What are we running from? He asked, his voice edged with suspicion. Kelzon gave a dark chuckle. There was a mix of amusement and impatience in his features, causing the sides of his lips to shift strangely. Then he said to Xander, Stay behind and find out if you're curious. Grimacing, Xander shook his head and fell in step with the group. As they moved swiftly through the forest, Xander kept glancing over his shoulder. The eerie cries had grown fainter but still lingered in the air. But that wasn't all. Xander got that feeling again. He was being watched.